less news, eyeballs, and content. The panelists for this session, Nishtha Gautam, John Elliott, Abhinandan Sekhri, in conversation with Rajeev Punnoli. So just a minute and we will be back here with the panelists. So session, more views, less news, eyeballs, and content. Let's welcome Nishtha Gautam, John Elliott, Abhinandan Sekhri, in conversation with Rajeev Punnoli Irupattil. Rajeev Punnoli, he'll be doing the conversation. So Rajeev Punnoli is a veteran investigative journalist and editor who has held senior position with Indian Express, Times of India, India Today, and The Hindu. He currently serves as the executive editor of the Mathrubhumi. Over to you, Rajiv.
Thank you. It's nice to be with these panelists. We never met before, but I've heard about you, and I'll be hearing about you, and we have just met. What we are going to discuss today is something that's so vital at this point of time in India. And I don't have to tell you why. I'm going to tell most of you why. We'll get to that during the course of our conversation, in any case. This is a time like no other for the media, for a whole lot of reasons which we'll get to in the course of our conversation, but before we start, just want to put in a couple of words on that, and our panelists will be explaining it further. We, at this moment, are a country besieged by a situation which never existed even 10 years ago, as far as the media is concerned. This is the time when the mainstream media itself has been subjugated to an extent that it's ceased to work the way it did or the way it ought to do by a whole lot of factors, and not just the social media, which a lot of people talk about. The media is being strangulated, it's being suffocated from all sides by the government, by the law, and by so many other players who are keen to leverage its potential, who are keen to use its powers, who are keen to help themselves to a situation in which they can override the power and the reach of the traditional media, which includes the print, TV, and to an extent, even the established digital fora. We'll start with what actually is the problem in India that a typical journalist faces, be it the print or the TV or any of the other media. We'll start with him.
Yeah, thanks. Well, as the subject says, views versus news. I think that is the overarching problem of digital media and even television media, as we know it, broadcast. And fundamentally, I think that is because of the model. The revenue model is flawed. And it's not because there was no better model available. It's because broadcast and print only had a one-way, transaction with the viewer. And internet has changed that. And I'll just tell you why I think that's a good thing and why I think less views and more news will be the hallmark of digital journalism. But just purely why there is so much of shouting during the primetime band in news is because it's cheap, it's inexpensive, and it provides a circus that a viewer wants to see, maybe not necessarily wants to pay. If you just line up 4 or 5 panelists and get them to fight, it creates noise, it creates, I watch it purely for entertainment. I don't think I'm getting any value as a news consumer from it. But because the world over, and it's not just in India, a big boss or a reality show will always have more viewers than a hard news show. News is kind of bending towards becoming that reality show where you see people shout, you've seen people getting slapped, you've seen people, turning each other out. And that is because the more eyeballs you get, the more you can charge your advertisers. I have the numbers, actually. I left that in my bag. I'll get it at some point. And that logic makes news what it is today. And coupled with that, the polarized times we live in, that the world over, and especially in India, and a government that wants that kind of noise. And I can give you several examples, whether it is the Tukde gang or any other such inaccurate information that goes out from news platforms, but gets a lot of eyeballs, makes views dependent on the circus that you see. And at least newslaundry.com, and never lose an opportunity to plug your own product. We don't take advertisements. It is only a subscription-driven news model, and I think the internet allows that. And as long as viewers are expected to pay for news, I do believe they will pay for news that is hardcore reportage and not just noise and clickbait. And actually there are various news platforms the world over that prove that, and I think India is also going to go down that way. So for now, what I'll say is that subscription models online can challenge this saturation of views on television. That is a problem with television. I don't think that will spill into serious news platforms, and I don't consider Facebook posts and Twitter posts serious news platforms. No one is going to pay for that. So if anything that is going to change that will be the commerce behind it. That's my piece.
Would you like to add to that?
I agree with Abhinandan when he says that the revenue model needs to really, upgrade itself. And for that, I think there needs to be a consensus among multiple platforms, be it print or TV or digital, where you make the subscriber pay for what you're offering them, because free mein to phir yahi milega, cheekna chillana milega. But I beg to differ at one limited point here, that the moment you say that, okay, I watch this show and I do not want to name a particular channel, because by and large every channel is guilty of putting that circus together. But what are we as consumers doing there? So Abhinandan is perhaps watching it only for entertainment and not for any news value, but it is giving that particular channel one more viewer, Right. Many people may be consuming that circus for its entertainment value, but it is giving those platforms the numbers that they need to pull in advertisements, and that in a way sort of, it presents a situation which is largely skewed because it's a demand and supply thing. I want to see that circus, which is why I'm being offered that circus. Right, so to hold only the government responsible for the crisis, or only people who are putting that circus together is slightly inadequate, I would say, because we as consumers, and I include myself in that category, as a consumer of news, we need to take responsibility for that. We need to be able to demand a lot better than we are getting at the moment if we think that it's not working out for us.
That's interesting, but if you look at it from another perspective, not just the consumer's perspective, if you look at it from the other side, if we go back some 30 years to a time when Edward Harman and Noam Chomsky came out with a book called Manufacturing Consent. Now, here listed a few filters that filter out the truth from journalism, which makes news non-news. Now, one of them was dependence on advertisers. The second was dependence on your sources. And the third, if I remember correctly, was dependence on the whims and fancies of your owners. And fourth was favoring the dominant ideology of the time. Now, can we honestly say that, in spite of the fact that what you said is absolutely right, there's a lot of things that need to happen from the viewers or readers' side, fine, but from the journalist side, from the side of the media, are those things being taken care of the way they should be?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
I was just talking about Noam Chomsky's filters.
I think the thing to remember here is that readers and viewers decide what succeeds. One of the things to remember is that going back to print newspapers, newspapers produce what their readers want. They may lead opinion, they may upset people with what they do, but if people don't like newspapers, then they don't buy them. And similarly, if Indian audiences, since we're talking about India, didn't watch the TV programs that we're all being so righteous in saying are appalling, then they wouldn't continue. They only watch these programs in the evenings with everybody shouting at each other in little boxes, only exist because people watch them. If they didn't watch them, there wouldn't be any advertising and they will collapse. So I'm asking governments to do things, or the owners to do things, or whatever else, is just against the whole basis of capitalist news organizations. People produce what the viewers or what the readers want.
A peculiar thing that's happened over the last few years in Indian journalism is probably that dissent has disappeared from the newsrooms. Skepticism has disappeared, because these were the two cornerstones that every media man used to swear by. Where is dissent? Where is skepticism now? Now, this is something we need to explain, we need to examine in detail. There are, I'll have the versions on it. I have a few, this is what I think about it. I may be wrong, you can correct me. One is that if you look at sources, and if you go back to the Chomsky's filters, now if you look at sources, there was a time, if you remember the 2G scam and so many other scams and things that have been going on and that's been exposed. Now all this were possible because there were a lot of whistleblowers where it mattered, who were willing to part with the information that the media wanted. And they were accessible to the media at that point of time. Now, what's happened now is that I'm not blaming a particular government, I'm not blaming a particular ideology, I'm not blaming individuals. Maybe I should blame the system for this. What has happened now is that a lot of access has been closed now. You don't have actual whistleblowers who matter in the bureaucracy or in politics because there's a pervasive fear of a backlash. There's a pervasive fear about what could happen to you if you parted with information. There's also a certain degree of, I don't know how to put it. There's a certain tendency to curry favors with the ideology that would actually help you carry on with your business. I don't want to put out any examples because that will be unfair because there are too many and I don't want to leave out any, that's why. And but what's if you look around at the mainstream media in India at this point, you find that there are a lot of senior journalists who now bend backwards, who are at one point of time the torchbearers in this country, the people who had exposed a lot of wrongdoings, a lot of corruption, a lot of other things which the reader ought to know or should know. Now, you find a good portion of them having bent backwards. People who cover in fear, people who actually hold on to their jobs for dear life because at any moment, at any point of time, the owners can be persuaded to kick them out of the jobs. It's come to a situation where the insecurity is so appalling that true journalism appears to have been dying in the newsrooms. I would like to have your opinion on this.
Yeah, can I just start with saying that in India, it just seems that we are very fond of this overarching sense of foreboding and this idea that, oh, apocalypse is upon us and Indian journalism has died and we are so beholden to the governing forces of the country that there is no independence left. Now, I beg to disagree when you say that, this pervasive fear has come in, pervasive fear that what would happen if I part with information, I could be killed or, could be suspended or whatever. And that has become a hurdle in investigative journalism. Is that what you're trying to say? But whistleblowers have always faced similar dangers. They have always been fearful. And yet, when they wanted to put out information, they always put that out. They continue to do so, otherwise nothing would get exposed. Otherwise, no scam would be unearthed, right? You need information from an insider. And a willing insider would always put it out after weighing, whether what he or she is doing is worth the risk that comes with it. When you talk about access, if we say that access to the government has been, has been denied to the media, it comes with both the goods and the bads, the positives and the negatives, because when you have access, you also sort of, your ability to critique those you are hobnobbing with also gets impacted. How do I, so here is the minister that I shared a drink with. How do I go out and file a story about his misdemeanors? Right, so it works both ways. So a little distance definitely goes a long way when it comes to upholding independence of journalism.
You're right about that, but that's not what I meant actually. But anyway, I'll try to explain to you. Now, what I meant was the readiness to part with information is not what it was 10 years ago.
No, No, and that's exactly what I responded to, that people are sharing information, maybe not with people, maybe not with me or people who are saying that information is not being shared, but there are people who are indeed getting information out. Otherwise, as I said, nothing would get to see the light of the day.
Let me step in there and also explain who I am, since I'm probably going to disagree with our moderator through most of this session. My name's John Elliott. I'm not in the program. I'm on later in the festival. And I've been a journalist in India for 25 years and have seen a lot of developments. I first came here in the 80s. And I'm going to do a plug. An updated version of my book, Implosion, arrived in the bookshop half an hour ago. So if anybody wants to go and buy it after this session, that would be lovely. Now I want to come back to access, because I had access to tell you all that just then. Access is, as you say, a two-way thing. If sources don't trust journalists, and if sources don't trust reporters and their editors to ensure that what they tell them is reported in a balanced way, then those sources will close down. And there's no point in sitting up here complaining and saying, oh my God, the world has changed. The world has changed. About 10 years ago, I was the editor of an anthology of foreign correspondents' writings over the previous 50 years. And some of the most interesting writings came from the Nehru period in the 50s and in the 50s, when journalists had instant access to Nehru and to many other people. My old colleague, Mark Tully, who's a famous BBC correspondent, if one talks to him, he had chief ministers wandering in and out of his flat talking to him, out of his office. That's all changed over the years for a variety of reasons, and most recently because of security. Well, security over a number of years, and most recently maybe under the current government, because the current government doesn't want to talk, and because ministers and bureaucrats are scared to say anything because of the guy at the top who probably knows everything they say, and they don't know what's going to happen to them after. So the Prime Minister is responsible, probably, for the lack of access that journalists have now. But generally, journalists have access to sources who those sources trust to report them in a fair way. In the Indian newspapers, there's not nearly enough editorial control. There's not nearly enough instruction and leading and teaching of journalists. So you get poor quality reporting, and so the sources dry up.
There's a time when editors have been sacked for reasons that I don't want to describe each of these cases here, for reasons that would have looked very, very silly some time back. There's an editor who was just sacked about 6 months back, a few months back, who ran a column called The Hate Tracker in a particular newspaper, and he's not been hobnobbing with the kind of people that the owners who are under pressure from the government wanted him to do. There was another one who ran a program on TV who exposed a particular ruse that the government had come up with as part of its image building exercise. There are a lot of examples like that. I don't want to get into that. No, but what I said was not about trust. It's not that sources don't trust journalists anymore. It's that the sources are afraid of being sources.
That's my point, and that's what John also said.
Let me just finish.
Can I just correct you right there? That when people are saying that, okay, we are afraid. They are afraid of two things. That how the establishment that they are working for or have access to would react when they find out that this person A has given out information. But that risk, and that's my limited point here, that risk has always been there. It has remained unchanged. Journalists have always relied upon and endangered their sources since time immemorial.
No, that's very true. That's very true. It's always been there. The risk has always been there, but not to the degrees in which we face it, because I don't want to quote examples that would be unfair.
No, it's not.
So, I agree. I mean, I think it's been there, but I also agree not to the extent it is today. for example, I think a very obvious documentary film or a story to do is, let's go in search of Mr. Modi's class teacher. A man who's, said that I was in this school, the degree is not available. For me, a documentary to do is, let's go find someone who sat next to him in class or someone who taught him. Till date, no one's come up. It's a very obvious documentary. It can be fun, it's informative. I used to make documentary films. I can tell you for sure I will not find the funding or a platform to run this documentary. I do think there is more fear today than there was earlier. I'm not saying there was no fear earlier, but I think as a news professional who's been in this since 1995, there is my colleagues are way more fearful today than they were earlier. Having said that, it is also true that the story on Robert Vadra's land deals was there with all journalists, but it was Arvind Kejriwal's press conference that actually said, that questioned the deal. No journalist questioned that deal. So yes, it did exist. But I just want to come back to the point about views versus news. I have the numbers here of the eyeballs that you're talking about. I think one basic thing we need to understand is no one changes anything by saying, this is a good thing to do and that's a bad thing to do. No one gives a damn. Because human nature is such. Big Boss is not India's creation. It was created in Norway or something as a reality show. That will always have more views anywhere in the world. That is human nature. So to say that, ye mat dekho, ye gandi baat hai, you can keep saying that, nothing changes. Fundamentally, I'm just going to give you some figures. This is from the readership survey and the BARC figures. The Times of India's readership is 13 million, Hindustan Times is 6 million, Hindu is 4 million. Now let me give you the numbers as far as prime time is concerned on television channels. We're talking 139 million, 112 million, 105 million, there's Aaj Tak, Zee TV, ABP. So you see the numbers who are watching that channel for its entertainment is not 2 or 3 times, it's 10 times. And you cannot tell millions of people, oh, it's a very bad thing you're doing. I want to watch it for entertainment. You're no one to lecture me on what I should or should not consume. So if something has to change to bring journalism back to the centerpiece, it is the revenue model and the economic model. The revenue model is such that there is no example of any digital platform where people pay you money to hear you shout. People will watch it if it's free. They will not pay you for that. And right now, I don't want to get into that, it's a little complicated, but how channel bouquets happen, now they've allowed you to start subscribing to a channel at the time. But as long as bouquets happen, you're flipping, you'll watch some nonsense, you stick to it, that counts as an impression. Yeah. Whereas when you subscribe to a newspaper, even though that is, I'm not saying the newspapers are the best right now, but compared to television, they do have more journalism. In fact, most of these shouting matches is a newspaper report they pick up and say, now let's shout about it, or pick up a tweet and now let's shout about it. No real journalism goes into that. And any example where real journalism is happening is a subscription-driven model. Now, having said that, social media is one of the issues that comes up. Social media is a great platform. It's a pipeline to spread stuff, but I don't think it has the credibility or ever will have the credibility of established credible platforms. So therefore, I think the threat of social media taking over is a little overblown. It will be there. It will be there for time pass. It is not going to replace journalism. And as far as journalism is concerned, access journalism is something that, there can be views on. There are, pros and cons to access journalism. I think there are certain serious problems with access journalism. But having said that, what digital does is digital changes everything. I think ever since the printing press, the most important invention of humankind is the internet, because it allows a two-way communication. People can pay you for what they think is good journalism, and if they don't pay you, those of you who understand jargon, CPI, the clicks per million or CPM rates are down so low that no news platform can survive purely on advertising and eyeballs, and I think that's what's going to solve the problem.
But the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed have both announced in the last few days that they're laying off hundreds of staff.
That's because they are advertising driven and not subscription driven.
That's because?
They're ad driven and not subscription driven. The Boston Globe, the Texas Tribune, their correspondent, New York Times, 67% of New York Times revenue comes from subscription and only, just about 30 comes from ads.
There's something very disturbing I'd hear about this Huffington Post way of working, in the sense that they pay their writers according to the visibility, right? Now, the problem with that is, I don't know how much of actual journalism has to depend on visibility. I mean, in the sense that in-depth, actual, substantial journalism. Do you think that model is actually the kind of thing that should be emulated?
Yes, I think, see, we use the word content loosely. There is news, reportage, and journalism, and there is content. What Temur wore is content, it's not news, but it appears on news platforms because the revenue model is, in fact, I was just seeing there's a headline, what did Sara Ali Khan say when she was asked that will you take 1 crore to slap your brother or something? Like, it was on a news platform, you know, everyone was carrying that as a headline. That's content, that's not news. But news will be rewarded because it's like the lighthouse. It's a very, you know, famous economic problem. Who pays for a lighthouse? Like, once you put a lighthouse, every boat, every ship passing benefits from it. You can't say only those who pay the toll tax will see the light, everybody else close your eyes. Everybody benefits. News is like that. If you have 1 million committed people, and there are those many people who are willing to pay for news, they will pay for journalism that benefits everybody else.
Well, another problem is that a couple of years back in US, years back in US, there's a study, there's a survey which said that on the digital platforms, the average time spent by an average viewer is less than 15 seconds. How much of time, I mean, how can journalism as such survive in that kind of a scenario?
That's because you've said on a digital platform, and that digital platform includes, I'm guessing, you know, Kim Kardashian's posterior and all sorts of other stuff. I'm talking about news. When people consume news, they are doing it for a different reason. When they're just scrolling through time pass, they're doing it for a different reason. And the problem with digital is it clubs everything together, and therefore we get a very warped picture of what actually is.
Can I add to what?
I'll just one sec. 85% of the sites surveyed were news sites.
Sorry?
85% of the sites that figured in that survey were news sites.
Like I said, Huffington Post is also a news site, and the site that's running Sara Ali Khan is also a news site. When your revenue model is journalism, like their Correspondent is one of the most, you know, successful examples of Europe. Now they've moved to America. I had a conversation with their founder. They raised a lot of money, about $6 million, from just people willing to pay for journalism. Like I said, New York Times has subscribers that outstrips advertisers. As long as the clicks per million model is what your platform's model is, everyone who comes up shows up as an impression. So, like I said, these are what we call vanity metrics. Vanity metrics mean nothing. One has to go a step lower to see where is the money coming from.
It's, you know, and I'm so glad that Abhinandan brought to the fore the idea of and the difference between content and news. Yes, Temur is not news really. You know, what he ate, what he did with his nanny. I mean, yeah, it appears on my mobile phone, but I'm not really interested in that, right? Or I may be interested in that. I mean, who am I to say? But, you know, when it comes to putting headlines to, and this brings us back to what this panel was supposed to be, news and views, you know, how we editorialize content sometimes. And when we market, you know, our own biases as news, because those are views, right? They're not news. They are not factual content offerings that we are giving out. I think therein also lies the danger of skewing this entire thing. You know, even the revenue model gets completely skewed by that, because then you are actually playing to the gallery. You are serving people what, you know, what they are consuming, and the metrics for that would be impressions, or it could be something else.
John, would you like to add to that, and then we'll go for questions?
Sorry?
Would you like to add to what she said right now?
I think the problem is that in newspapers, in good newspapers, there's a clear division between the comment pages and the news pages, and you know where to find them. On the net, you don't know where to find them. If you turn on to any of the websites that are reliable in India, you don't know whether you're going to read comment or whether you're going to read news. I don't think it's packaged. But I think a bigger, can I move this on to somewhere else? I think one of the main problems of the media here is ownership. Can we move on to ownership? Because nobody knows who owns most of the newspapers. In Britain, Rupert Murdoch owns the Times and he owns the Sun. And we all know what we read in those newspapers is going to be coloured by his own commercial ambitions or political ambitions when it suits him. In this country, most people do not know how much Mukesh Ambani actually owns, nor why he wants to own it or what he wants to do with it when he does own it. As I just said, with Murdoch, we do know. It's to push his political ambitions, it's to push his TV stations, which he doesn't always succeed in doing, and there's open debate and there's visibility. Here, I would guess that a handful of those of you in the audience actually have any idea how much Mukesh Ambani, and he's the main character here, actually owns.
That's interesting. We'll take a few questions now.
Yeah, we just have 3 minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Pardon?
3 minutes left.
Hi, greetings. Whilst throughout the course of the discussion, we realized that switching the revenue model is the most ideal solution to this, don't you think that the fourth pillar of democracy, isn't it a sad reality that we have to pay for it to actually get a quality fourth pillar of democracy?
Well, someone has been paying for it. It's not been free, but so far the advertiser has been paying for it. And the logic of an advertiser paying for it, like the Newslaundry's motto is, when the public pays, the public is served, and advertisers pay, advertisers are served. So up till now, it's not like no one's been paying for it. And since I'm here, I'll just plug a discount we have at newslaundry.com. You can click and subscribe and pay to keep news free. And if you put JLF, you get a 50% discount. So yeah, if you don't pay for news, Mr. Ambani will, then it's going to serve you, it's going to serve him.
Who's next? We don't have much time. We'll take just one more question.
Last question.
The last question.
I really love Newslaundry and The Wire and the Caravan magazine. My question is, I really don't agree with what you said, sir, John. You talked about entertainment and that you cater to what sells, right? This is like Trump catering to the lowest, the base, right? But the question is not who he's catering to and the binary. Like he's catering to the lowest common denominator, right? That to me is what is happening to the mainstream media. So I like what Abhinandan talked about, the beacon, the lighthouse, right? So for me, as a consumer, it's about credibility, right? To me, the lighthouse example is credibility.
We have little time. Just your question.
So I'm saying that...
Just your question.
So my question is, if I were to put a bullet into Modi's head and kill him today, I'm sure the people of my community are going to die, right? How do you as a newsroom, like editor, step in and prevent that? So it's about prevention, not cure.
I don't think if that's, what kind of prevention are we talking about here?
So in the midst of lynchings, so for example, in the midst of lynchings, we don't look at news as entertainment. We look at editors and people with credibility, people who speak truth to the power. People, like in the midst of all that's going on, like as a mountaineer, I'm a mountaineer, so for me, if it's a big mountain, it excites me.
I'm sorry, the time is up. If you want to wind up the session, you just have 3, 2, 0, no seconds. The time is up. Thank you very, very much for being here. Our sessions are for limited time. I know you have a lot of questions. They will be around, so anytime you can catch them, you can put up your questions and they'll definitely satisfy you. But thank you.